Now, one of the things that makes our legs in this project so special is going to be the leg indent detail that goes in the bottom. We're going to use a specialized jig and our router to do it, and the jig was inspired from Daryl Peart's book. Again, highly recommend you guys pick this up, and he outlines a way of creating a specialized jig, which is really nothing more than a guide allowing the router to ride at a little bit of an angle, so we create this sort of tapered indent. So we'll use that as influence, but we'll probably, customize it so it fits our legs and our project absolutely perfectly. So let me show you all the parts for the jig, and then we'll put it together. So here's what you're going to need. 2 pieces of 3/4 inch ply cut to 12 inches in length and 2 5/8 of an inch in width. You'll also need 2 smaller pieces of 3/4 inch ply cut to 2 inches by 1 3/4 inches. And that 1 3/4 inch dimension is actually to match the width of our legs. And in fact, if you want, you could have this 1 3/4 inch just be a couple of thousandths wider than the leg. That'll make a little bit more sense after we put the jig together. You'll also want 2 rails made of solid wood. I cut mine to 12 inches long. They're about 1 inch in width and 3/4 of an inch thick. And you'll also need a little bit of scrap material that we'll use as shims to help give our jig the appropriate angle. So we're going to start here by gluing together the platform. Take a little bit of glue on these smaller pieces on the 2-inch side. And place 1 at each end. Make sure they're flush at the outside. Should be good to go. While pressing down, just add a little clamping pressure. And now, since there might be a little squeeze out at the bottom, we certainly don't want to glue this to our bench, so make sure you move it around or place it on end. Now, while this glue is drying, it's not a bad idea to take one of your rails, make it flush with the inside of our platform here, and just draw yourself a line. That's going to help us later on when we're driving the screws down into these rails. Just gives you an idea of exactly where the safe zone is to drive that screw. So now the platform is dry, and I'm going to lay out my 2 rails on the bench like so. And what I want to try to do is line up the inside edges with the inside edges of the platform. So sort of looking from above here. And once everything looks like it's lined up, I'm going to add a clamp to secure it in place. Another clamp on this side. And don't tighten it all the way because things are going to move on you, so keep it relatively loose so you can shift things around a little bit. And once it's nice and even, perfectly smooth with that inside wall, then we can hammer down the clamps. All right, now I'm just going to pre-drill for a few screws. And 1 1/4 inch screws should do the trick. So here's how this is going to work. You basically put the jig right onto the leg in the area where you want that leg indent, and we'll of course have to position it forward and back. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. But the key thing is to prop the one end up a little bit because we need our router bit to start deeper at this side and taper off so it gets to the point where it's not actually making any cuts at all once it's on this side. So the easiest way to do that is just with this little removable shim. Now, if you're doing a lot of these, you can certainly make a more permanent solution than this, but I'd like to maybe use this jig again in the future, and I may not want those exact same dimensions. So I'm just going to slide my little shim underneath this area here, and then I'll be able to clamp everything in place and stabilize it, and then run my router through the guide area. Now, speaking of the router, we should talk about that for a moment. Now, the router is set up with a guide bushing and a straight bit. It happens to be a 1-inch guide bushing and a 1/2-inch bit, and this is all taken into consideration with the design of the jig to make sure that we get the results that we want. If you use a different size guide bushing or a different size bit, you have to be aware of what that offset is and take that into consideration when you build your jig. But as it stands now, the 1-inch guide bushing and the 1/2-inch bit with the jig that I've shown you how to make will give you the proper results for that particular size leg. Now we do need to place a guideline at the bottom of the leg, and it's going to help us position our jig properly. We know that the tapered indent, we want it to stop 3/4 of an inch from the bottom of the leg, but we have to take into account the offset from the guide bushing. That offset is a 1/4 inch. So what I'm going to do is put a line here at a 1/2 inch, because we know that the bit is actually cutting a 1/4 inch in front of that line, so that when it's all said and done, we wind up getting our 3/4 of an inch, which is what we really want. But this line is the one that helps us locate our jig in the proper spot. So the first thing I want to do is make sure I line up the jig with that line that we just put on the leg. Right about there. Still want to see some pencil line. That's perfect. So now I'm going to take that 1/4 inch shim and insert it under this side to raise it up. And you might move a little bit here, so make sure you make the appropriate adjustments. Now I'm going to add a clamp at the back, but I'm not going to clamp it down real hard just yet because of the way that shim is placed in there. It could very well prop up the front as I add clamping pressure, so just enough to hold it in place, and it will start to lift. But the idea is to take another clamp, push down all the way, and add this other clamp from side to side. That's going to hold the front down for us. And now we can come back again to the back here and secure it completely so we know it's not going to move during the routing. So now I'm just going to drop the router right onto the jig, and we need to set the depth of cut. Now we want that indent to be about 1/8 of an inch at its deepest section. So what I'm going to do is bring the router all the way to the front till it hits the jig. Plunge down till I make contact with the surface, and that's our ground zero. Tighten it in place and make your adjustment so that you plunge 1/8 of an inch. This is very similar to what we did when we made the mortises with our router, but all we want here is an 1/8 inch deep cut. So I've got mine already set to make a perfect 1/8 inch cut. Lift everything back up, attach the vac, and we'll be ready to roll. Now if all goes well, you should have a perfect indent. Look at that, 1/8 inch deep, and it goes about 4 inches up. Let's just double check and take a measurement. Look at that. Just at 4 inches is when it starts to sort of lift off, and you can't really tell that it made any contact there. So that is pretty darn good. Now, I would recommend that you make a test cut first in a scrap piece if you've got it. You want to confirm everything before you do this to your good legs. But once you have it, the good thing is you've got the setup down perfect. You just rotate it 90 degrees and do the next face. And you want to do this on all 4 faces. Now one last thing that we need to do to the bottom of the legs is create a little bit of a gentle slope here right at the edge. This is not something that you could really see in the SketchUp drawing, but it's an optional thing that you can add, and I think it's kind of a nice touch at the bottom here. So in order to make sure that the profile is even on all 4 sides, we're going to make a little template that we'll use to trace the shape on there. So any piece of scrap will do, something nice and thin like this is perfect, and let me show you how we mark it up. Now I'm just going to mark in a 1/2 inch from the edge, right at the top here, put a little mark. And then from this side, I'm going to measure in a 1/16 of an inch. Right there. Like that. Now we need to connect these 2 points with a little curve. And this little French curve is perfect for something like this. So just find a nice curve that looks good to your eye. Really no right or wrong curves here. Okay, very subtle. but it's going to make a nice visual difference. Now this curve is very small and very subtle, so I wouldn't even really use a cutting tool on this. I'm just going to get a little bit of sandpaper on a sanding block and slowly but surely work my way back to my pencil line. So now all I need to do is take our little template here, line it up with the bottom of the leg, trace on our shape. Now you have a lot of options for how you remove this little bit of material. The oscillating spindle sander certainly is a good one. You could just use some sandpaper if you want to with a nice sanding block. Even just a piece of wood is certainly enough with some sandpaper on it. Or if you want to rush it a little bit and just kind of get the, hog away some of the extra material here, you can use a block plane, and that'll sort of give you a head start. In fact, that's what I'm going to do. Now, of course, as I do this, I'm removing one of my sets of pencil lines, and that's okay. We could always draw it back on there if we still need a reference later. Okay, that's one side. And once you're ready to do the next one, take your little template here and put it on the end where you just basically put the curve. Obviously it removes your pencil marks, but you can make a close approximation just by keeping your pencil almost vertical here. And that should be enough to give us a nice guideline as we use our plane again. Now, once you have the 4 profiles done, you just basically want to clean it up a little bit. Sand the flat area. You can start to create a little bit of a round over and ease these edges. We may hit that with a router later on toward the end of the project, but any of these sharp edges can go away now. And just ease it up a little bit. And it'll be less likely to be damaged later with any tooling that we hit it with. Feel free to sand the end grain and make sure you round over the corners down here because that's where it's going to split if it's going to. And we're also going to sand the actual indent itself. So grab a block of wood, some sandpaper, little 220 grit, get right up in there and smooth that out. Chances are your router bit did leave a little bit of some track marks in there and things that you want to clean up. Okay, once that's nice and smooth, and just grab a little bit of sandpaper and soften this inside edge. Remember, nothing is sharp in Greene and Greene. Now with 4 of these per leg, you've got quite a few to do, but take your time, enjoy this part of the process. These final details, finessing those little curves and those sharp edges, it's very important in the final look of the piece, and your patience will definitely be rewarded at this stage. The other thing I want to mention is you may not like this leg. What if you don't want the indents? Are there other things that you can do? Well, you could certainly leave your leg perfectly square. You don't have to put the leg indent if you don't want to. At the very least, I would still recommend you do something like this little profile that we added to the bottom, have it scoop in just a little bit. And in fact, there is a common Greene and Greene leg that starts square and just has the indent. The thing is, it's a little bit more substantial than this particular indent that we added here. So let me show you how to make that, and it's just a much simplified version of the leg that we just did. So this time, I'm going to measure in 1 inch. That's double what we did before. And I'm going to measure down 1/8 of an inch, which is also double what we did before. It's pretty good right there. Now the process is exactly the same as before. And this time I have a little bit more material to remove, so I think I'm tempted to use my oscillating spindle sander on this guy. Now back at the bench, we could just give it a little extra love here with some hand sanding and break the edges. And the end result is a very similar leg, just with a little bit more of a substantial curve because we don't really have that indent profile here, but nice and straightforward and absolutely beautiful. So those are two nice options for the front legs, but I thought about it a little bit more and I wanted to show you a third bonus option. Now this one, I call it a bonus because I'm not really going to be able to go into incredible depth about the process, primarily because I'm not a very experienced carver. I do a little bit here and there and I'm trying to learn and I want to get better, so things like this are a little bit of a challenge for me, but I think I'll be able to show you exactly what I do, talk you through my logic behind some of these things, but just understand that if you really want to get into carving, you should probably take a class or get a book or a DVD or something from someone who does have a lot of experience in that area. But there's no reason we should let that stop us from jumping in and doing our best to try something like this. And that's exactly what I've got here. Now I just put a little bit of water on here to give it a little extra definition so it's easier to see. But the design is actually only on two faces. The other two faces don't really get touched. It's got this taper that starts up at the top, ends abruptly where this sort of circular design starts, and everything is just scooped out a little bit to relieve material to show the face of this design here. So kind of unique, but like I said, this is specifically from a Greene piece, and it might be something you'd like to challenge yourself with. So speaking of challenging ourselves, let me show you exactly how I did it.
Here's the Greene plant stand that I'm using for inspiration. This is all I really have to go on, so here goes nothing. I start by drawing the grid work where I think it looks good. Once my guidelines are in place, I begin outlining the areas where there's a steep drop-off as opposed to a gradual slope. These areas need to be more defined, and it's important to sever these fibers first. With the outline established, I can very carefully begin cutting into the design. I can easily reinforce the shape by chiseling into the scribe lines. Notice how little chunks of wood just pop out? I do have to be gentle though, a little slip here could result in a large chunk of wood being removed. From this point on, it's all about instinct, and I find it difficult to verbalize what I'm actually doing. I'm just slowly removing material wherever it seems appropriate, using whatever chisel or carving tool gets the job done. So I'll just let you watch and enjoy, or laugh, as the case may be. I should point out here that I could be doing this safer. Although my fingers are technically out of the line of fire, I shouldn't really have my fingers there at all. But gripping the workpiece this way gave me the control that I needed for the cut, so it was a bit of a calculated risk. Just know that you want your hands completely out of the way whenever possible. The final stretch just involves softening all corners and making the design look as smooth and natural as possible, in any way that you can.
So that's all there is to it. Now, I could probably use a little refinement, and I think every time you carve something like this, you just get better at it each and every time. But to tell you the truth, this is the second one that I've done. Before I had the camera rolling, a couple days ago, I decided just to throw some marks down on a piece of scrap wood and see what I can do, just so I know what I'm in for. So this technically is my second attempt. And frankly, I think I could probably do a little bit more work on this to refine it just a little bit more. But let me show you the first attempt so you can see that this stuff doesn't go perfectly every time. You absolutely should practice anything new on scrap first. Take a look. So this piece here is my practice piece, and it might be a little bit hard to make out, but you can see I sort of just screwed this part up big time. As you're bringing the chisel in and you're cutting in with the grain, this little piece is incredibly fragile, and I found out the hard way. So I was very careful with this second run here to make sure that I did not pop that piece off. So that's probably the biggest problem area to watch out for, is that little lip at the bottom. And you can see I just kind of messed it up. I didn't go deep enough around the outside of the design, and part of the reason was, frankly, I got frustrated. I got this far and then popped that piece off and realized this was not going to be recoverable, so I left it where it was and said, you know what, let me start over with a new piece, and that's where this guy comes in. So you can see after just one practice run, I was able to refine the shape, refine the actual dimensions of this thing to get it much closer to what I see in the picture, and I'm pretty happy with the result here. So there you go, 3 beautiful Greene and Greene leg options. The only question at this point is, which one will you use? Thanks for watching.